I describe the role of startups as reversing the great deceleration because while it may feel, and certainly when you hear Eric describe the advances in machine learning, many of which we're investors in, there are some reasons to believe we live in a time of great change. Actually, in the United States at least, and maybe elsewhere, in many ways it's the opposite. It's stagnation that we're dealing with, and it's a crisis of national proportions. So let me describe how I see it. It's sort of twinned with the problem that may be accelerated by machine learning, which is the great decoupling, the trend since the late 70s, early 80s of productivity increasing. I remember all those early questions about whether computers would increase productivity too. And whether it's been computers or something else, productivity certainly increased. What hasn't is wages. And so I'll give you my perspective on it, my personal perspective on it. So just to explain where I come from, I've had an extremely messy path. My career is not an example of anything that anyone should emulate to get to where I am. I ran a nonprofit, which was focused on urban poverty in the main. I thought I would study this and did the beginning of what might have been a doctorate in economics, but I didn't make it. And so I have great respect for the economists in the room as a result. I then decided, because it was the first dot-com boom, and maybe business might have something to do with how money moves to solve problems, that I should learn something about business. So I made PowerPoint for a living as a management consultant. Value-added PowerPoint resale. It's a great business model. And I was literally on a conference call in my office one morning, I think it was a Tuesday morning, talking about the pricing of popcorn in the movie theater when a plane flew into one of the towers at the World Trade Center. It's my hometown in New York. And not long after I quit and went to go work in city government on rebuilding, and did that for a while, came to the conclusion that this business thing still might have something to it, joined a Fortune 500 company, got moved out here to San Francisco, which what I thought would be a year or two of some expat time in San Francisco. And that was 12 years and 2 children ago to run an online media business. And then I got addicted to the startup thing. I was extremely dismissive of startups. I got offered a job in 1994 writing HTML. And I was like, what are these blue links? There's never going to be anything here. So now my job is to invest in the future of this. So it just goes to show what the prognosis for me may be in that. But the reason I've landed on startups, and I then started a company and now invest in them, is because after having seen all of these tools that are available, government tools, philanthropic tools, research tools, I just love to work on the tool that is an early technology startup. And so I'll describe some of the potential. The unfortunate truth that I had to confront is that while I felt like I was living in this time, as I said, of great change, the data did not bear that out. And so just to give you an illustration, maybe the economists in the room know the dynamism data about the steady decline over decades of the rate at which businesses are formed, of long-term moves, of people shifting across sectors. This whole thing, I love like myths that come out at Future of Work conferences. I call it the Kabuki Theater of Future of Work conferences. Oh, but people are job hopping so fast now. Nope. That's true, maybe if you were a white man, then the data show you job hop more frequently now, but otherwise for everybody else, nope. And so just this thought exercise, which you're saying the 90s was a long time ago, my moment on this was I was watching Back to the Future with my son, set in 1985, and they go to the distant future with the flying cars, which is in 2015, and he said, hey, to me 1985 must feel like to you 1955. And I was like, he's right. But so, and then he has this board game, and I promise I'll get to the food for thought in a second, but just for context, he has this board game called Timeline, where you know this game, you arrange when things happen on a timeline, and one of them is about inventions. And so the late 19th century has these inventions. There's so many you can't even really look at them, but if you zoom in on any one of them with your eyes, I promise you'll see something that if you were alive at that time, you would think, holy shit, that's really cool. Like, that was an era. If I'd been born in 1846, I'm 43, you would go through, or almost 43, you would, in the course of my life, you would have seen antiseptics, the light bulb, toilet paper, fountain pens, motorcycles, Coca-Cola. I mean, it's like, what an incredible era to live in then. And so I do have some sympathy for the whole, we wanted flying cars, and what we got instead was, whatever it was that we got. And you think about, well, what are the causes of that slowdown? And there are many of them, and many of you know the structural reasons better than I do. I'll say that I believe one of the issues is that our new creations fall in a pretty narrow imaginative range. The people who make most of the new things that we make come from a very tight set of backgrounds. They're generally from a certain socioeconomic class. They're from a certain demographic background. I'll talk more about that. One of the things that our venture fund tries to do is we try to expose people in technology to leaders in other domains in American life. It's part of the reason that I'm here. It's part of the reason I serve on that commission on the future of work. And that could be economists and political leaders and science fiction writers. And in our travels, and Chantel, where's Chantel? Chantel, who's here in the room, is a VC who came with me on one of these trips. We go around the country to cities that have much less investment in innovation than San Francisco or Palo Alto does, and we try to diagnose some of the reasons why. And before he became Mayor Pete, we were in South Bend with Mayor Pete, and he said a really fascinating thing. He said, we have an asset in South Bend that you don't have in the big cities, which is we have regular people problems. And I mean, I'll just give you an example. The price of housing is so low in South Bend, which that doesn't sound like a problem, but it is such a problem because you can't borrow against a house in South Bend because the price of the house doesn't cover the fixed cost of originating the loan. And so they invested in a startup that bundles 4 houses at a time together to make a loan. It's just a great example. And so I think one of the antidotes to this deceleration is focusing on the great problems of our time. And of course, climate change is one of the great problems of our time. I hope there'll be lots of research on it. It's not something I know much about. I do know about work because I study it intensively. And when our fund started, we said, we're going to focus on the future of work. Why? Well, we saw all of this innovation happening. This was 2013. We saw all this innovation happening in the way you share photos with your mom and in the way we shop. And then you'd go to the office, and there are still workplaces where people use Lotus Notes. I mean, it was bizarre, this sort of mismatch. And we just kind of assumed that that would catch up. That was our kind of idea, is that the workplace experience would improve. And I started going to these future of work events, and I'd hear people talk about like new managerial methods. You should use a non-hierarchical system like holacracy. By the way, I've studied all these oddities if you want to talk about them at length. And what I realized is that was only capturing part of the problem. And the reason it was only capturing part of the problem is in part due to the technologies that Eric was just discussing. So we were, over my objection, the first fund to focus on AI. One of my colleagues, she came to me and she said, we should invest in AI. This is 2014. I said, you've been reading way too much science fiction. It's too early for all this stuff. And then she said, okay, I'm going to do some work on it. And our culture is, if any one person wants to do something, we can say any one person can invest in a company, because being wrong it's so easy to be wrong in my line of work that we want to encourage a very fault-tolerant system. So she went out and did a bunch of research and came back and had found 2,000 different machine intelligence companies of different kinds. And I said, okay, not only was I wrong, but we should swim like a whole school of fish, and we became primarily focused on machine intelligence, all still in the context of the future of work. And that's around when the world started with the most recent spate of the robots are going to take all the jobs. And I sort of thought, well, that's not going to, like the companies we invest in and just lives for us in society aren't going to work if that's the case. So I should study this. And I read all the books, and some of them, Second Machine Age and others, were incredibly informative. I went to all the conferences, and still I couldn't quite figure out why the discussion wasn't making sense to me. Oh, the robots will take all the jobs. No, they won't. They'll only take tasks. Oh, but when they introduce the ATMs, there's now more bank tellers. It all got very confusing. And what I decided to do was, together with a nonprofit, with New America, we embarked on a study to try to just assess what the likely effect of technology on work was going to be. And we gathered groups of American leaders together in different cities around the country to do a scenario planning exercise, because it's a good technique for when you can't predict precisely what's going to happen. And we also spoke to working people. We did conversations with truck drivers about the self-driving truck, fascinating kind of stuff. Most significant technology for a truck driver? Anybody have a guess? Huh? GPS. No, Netflix. It's super boring when you can only drive a certain number of hours per day. So they all love Netflix because you can actually then stop and rest and have something change. And so we compared all these scenarios, and what I realized is whether you believe that technology takes a lot of jobs away, whether it substitutes, whether it impacts things a little or a lot, whether it changes the form of work, whether we stop with this full-time thing and just atomize into a number of gigs, actually doesn't matter that much to the responses that you might have as a society. And the reason it doesn't matter that much is because we have enough of the dilemma in the present to work on. Like, the irony of studying the future of work is the crisis is here now. You know, the great decoupling has happened now. And so I see startups as a tool for addressing that, but if we're going to use the tool, then we have to be imaginative about how. So let me describe that. And you know, if I had to put, somebody said to me once, what's the problem you're really trying to solve? If I had to put a one-sentence version to it, it would be this. And again, I'm limited to the US context, which is what I know. It would be, the typical person in the United States who plays the game by the rules and goes to school and works hard does not have a good enough chance of providing for themselves and their family. Like, if you can't, poverty is an awful thing, inequality is an awful thing, but if the society fails to serve its typical person, like, what kind of a society are we building here? And I'm going to lead you on the imaginative exercise, in part with an example that the economist who worked with us on the Schiff Commission, who also happens to be, this commission with New America, who also happens to be my friendly neighborhood economist man, Jed Kolko, who's here, who gave me this example. If you had to think about, in the last 100 years, which technology was most significant to work, what would you guess? Not Netflix. The car? Car's a good guess. It could be the car. The pill. The point being that it's not just about the demand for work and what kinds of jobs exist, it's also about supply. It's about people who can enter the labor force and make choices. And these technologies have extremely unpredictable effects. I mean, who would have known that one of the most important media distribution services in the modern era would have started at South by Southwest as a way for, you know, mostly journalists and hipster tech kids to share what they had for breakfast. But that's what Twitter, you know, was. And so the thing that is workforce technology can be extremely hard to define. And I'm just, that said, going to lead you on a few hypotheses. Because in a way, one way that an early startup is similar to research that many of you do is, at its best, it's a search for truth done through testing and experimentation. I mean, it's the same as the behavioral science that can happen that we heard about earlier today in public-private partnerships. And one of the limiting reagents for that test is a good hypothesis. So I'll walk you through a few of them, not exhaustive list that's on my mind. What could a startup do that would benefit the typical person? Well, one thing it could do is help them realize the full suite of sources of power that they have. And so ways of organizing workers are now extremely embedded with technological services already, and dedicated services may go further. I'll give you examples of what I see already happening. In the tech world, we call this, I'm sure this is true in other domains too, we call this paving the cow paths, when you see something already happening and you try to just smooth the way. Video game workers who have long had some pretty difficult conditions, actually in any industry where people work out of passion. Sometimes working people are subjected to difficulties. I don't think anybody's quite, you know, crying for the plight of the video game art director in the same way that they are for others who struggle to make ends meet. But nonetheless, it can be really difficult. And they've formed a sectoral group called Game Workers United that uses a video game chat tool called Discord in order to communicate. If you look at the Google walkout, you know, was organized with many Google tools. And go through, by the way, the activity of workers just in tech companies, you know, the Amazon employees for climate justice, even informal campaigns like Uber employees who said, hey, our CEO shouldn't serve on this council that President Voldemort, you know, wants him to serve on, and got Travis to step off of the Trump council. You see it outside of tech. There's a group that was called Our Walmart that dealt with the fact that Walmart employees, which is, you know, second biggest employer in the United States, after the US military, that Walmart employees couldn't get access to their own benefits information without seeing it on a computer with their manager in the room. And so they just made an app where you on the outside could just look up your own benefits. And so we're seeing this beginning to happen. And by the way, just parenthetically, if you don't like the way that big tech is behaving, there's one and only one constituency that has power on big tech, and that's the people who work for the big tech companies. I think, you know, government has some power too, but this is probably the most knowledgeable and effective constituency. So organizing workers is one. A second is new sources of income and wealth. So the new occupations for workers who have some greater ability to contribute, whether in terms of wages or time. Some of them are you know, selling time in a certain way. We have certainly invested in marketplaces that help connect people who would like to work to work. Last night at dinner, somebody was sharing an idea with me for older people providing childcare. I love that idea because older workers are definitely demographically the meaty center of the target as far as where the numbers are for the future of work. So if you go to a future of work conference and somebody says, what are all these millennials doing? Just ignore them and focus on what people 55 and older are doing because they're going to be much more significant. Sometimes it's training. In vogue very much right now is training in computer programming skills, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. We've invested in a company called SV Academy that provides sales training. Just learning once you've been through school how to sell something, enormously valuable. And it doesn't have to be just time. So we're investors in a service called Wonder, askwonder.com. That's an online research service. And if you are a stay-at-home parent, and you want to use your mind in order to provide a valuable service for others, then being asked like, hey, what are the competitive dynamics of some industry in the UK turns out to be a wonderful kind of work. And so there's plenty more opportunity here as far as creating new occupations. I'll give you a third one, which is productivity tools. But we all have productivity tools for knowledge workers because founders tend to make things for themselves. So you may have used Slack. We were proud investors in that. You may have used a software, email software called Superhuman. All these things serve the people who tend to make software. But outside of the world of sort of precious graphic designers or venture capitalists, there is much, much more work out there that is underserved by tooling. And the more that founders of companies can understand and empathize with the issues that folks who do not have high wages have, the more likely they are to be productive and hopefully claim some of that in the form of wages. Another form of professional development is around social capital. So I'll tell you a story of what I precisely mean by that. I used to run as I said, an online media business. And we struggled to hire software engineers because every time we made an offer to that recent Stanford graduate, Facebook would also make them an offer. And Facebook could pay a lot more. And I remember I was the CEO of a company wooing a recent college student, which is, there's something really nice about that. I didn't mind doing that. That was nice. But then I walked him around the office, and I remember he opened up the fridge, and he said, and literally what he blurted out was, "No Adwala." And he might have been kidding. He might not have been, but either way, I was like, okay, we need to do something different. And so we started hiring software engineers without looking at their resumes. And we basically decided that what we would do is see if we can invent a different hiring process. We hired them. Usually in a normal hiring process, you're trying to maximize for how talented the person is and satisfy yourself they're passionate enough. Oh yeah, this person's great. Are they good with what we do? Okay, let's hire them. We just did it the other way around, which is we tried to satisfy ourselves with how talented they were and then maximize for the people who were the most passionate. So we had them submit a statement of interest, which was a video basically about how excited they were. It's a video game company, so it's not, you can harness the fact that people are excited to work for you. And then do a simple coding test. But then we didn't hire them right away. We put them through a 6-week training program where we told them at the end they might get a job, but otherwise they'd get some training. And what we expected is we'd need to teach them all the hard skills of how to program computers and, but do it our way, slightly better than what you may have learned online. The reality is we had to do almost none of that. Almost everything that we had to do was expose them to the norms of a modern workplace, which is to say, when somebody invites you to a meeting, you should either say yes or say no. If you say yes, you should come. If you go to the meeting, it should be a very special meeting if you want to hug everybody afterward, not a normal meeting, because that may make people feel uncomfortable. And it was literally stuff like that for 6 weeks. And so much of the barrier, like when I saw Amazon announce its training program recently, they announced a tremendous amount of money in total, which is really more a statement of how big Amazon is. And then they described what sounded like classroom trainings for workers. And you've all been in classroom trainings in your jobs. Like, you don't learn anything in those trainings for the most part. And I thought, well, the power to be able to send an email to somebody who has a personal relationship with me and might be able to consider me for a job might be much more. And we're seeing that now with services that enable shadowing in the workplace, spending a day or a week with somebody. Apprenticeships are another variation on this. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of stuff to be done in the world of building social capital to workers. Then there are some popular areas that I just say, avoid's probably too strong because there are great companies to be built in these areas, but it's just not, it's the default things people think about, and I think about them less. So one of them is trainings for companies, sort of showing up and being like, we've got a better way to teach your employees how to do X. And one of the issues with those is that if the company, one difference in workforce compared to many other domains of startups is, many domains of startups, not all, the buyer and the user are the same person. So Amazon, you buy a book, you're the user of the book, you're the buyer of the book. In the case of Facebook or any advertising company, that's not the case. The buyer is the advertiser, the user is you. Maybe you're the product. In the case of training, the company is usually the buyer, but the user is the employee trying to develop. And the incentives just diverge too often. Oftentimes those trainings are also check-the-box compliance-driven. It's great that we have laws that require sexual harassment training, for example, as we do here in California. But if it's merely done because it's driven by compliance and done at a minimal way just to satisfy the compliance needs, that can be less than productive. Second is there are so many startups that do some form of technology skilling because tech people, of course, believe that if you do what I do, you can be as great as I am. And so they'll help you learn how to do the things that they do. And that's great and wonderful. And we certainly have, we are investors in an after-school center that's sort of like, imagine a Kumon for coding. But you better have a really different perspective on how you're going to do it in order to succeed. Productivity for knowledge work, man, I mean, if I get pitched another, like we got a doohickey you plug into your calendar that makes your calendar slightly better, I don't know what I'm gonna do. That said, calendars are still a mess to manage, and calendars and contacts are still wonderful domains, but it's just that the bar, because so many people look at it for knowing what it is you want to do, is significantly higher. And so I think that may be helpful for those of you who are thinking about starting a company or investing in one, but not everybody is doing that, although I think pretty much everybody could if you wanted to. But let me talk about some of the systemic barriers for a minute, and then I'll close, because I think all of us can be involved in removing some of these systemic barriers. There are lots that the economists in the room know about much better than I do. What really is the role of monopoly and monopsony power? What really is the issue with licensing and certification requirements? And I think all of those are essential and important to continue to study. But we do still need more capital. And capital of all kinds of different patiences, levels of patience. And there is tremendous lack of diversity in venture capital, which means that only founders of certain backgrounds tend to get backed, and that's a real problem. We have to do something about that as an industry. But then even just beyond venture capital, we need more of other kinds of capital that provoke innovation. I mean, I like to say that government is the first VC. All the patience is government has the longest time horizon. Investing in extremely speculative research, scientific invention, R&D. Big companies also do invest. I mean, Microsoft Research and Google X and all of the, Bloomberg certainly has had the resources to do long-term, patient, multi-year projects. VCs, by the way, we love to think of ourselves as the innovation economy. Really, the way I think of it is like when the power cable is like laying there on the floor and somebody just needs to pick it up and stretch it that extra inch and plug it in. We're like the stretching the extra inch because our source of capital, we're taking so much risk, financial risk, that we just need progress to be demonstrated in 18 to 24-month increments. So we need capital of all the different patiences. And then I just say, watching how we think about these concepts is really important. Something I learned from a restaurant organizer not too long ago is somebody was describing low-skill jobs. And all of us have been in an environment where we've heard somebody say, oh, this is a high-skill job, it's a low-skill job. And she said, oh, hold on, I just want to stop you there for a second. What do you mean by low-skill jobs? I said, well, jobs that require less skill. And she said, if you took an AI PhD student and asked them to be a waiter for a night and saw how well they did, good luck. There are low-wage jobs, there are high-wage jobs, but her point, and I totally accept this, is that there is actually no such thing like a spectrum of skills. There may be skills that require more years of schooling in order to attain, but that doesn't make them lower or higher. And so I think just watching our cultural assumptions and language is part of it. We do have too few hypotheses, and I think I've described a few areas, but I'll also say, how else could you get at other hypotheses? Academic study could give people suggestions for areas that they should explore. More lived experience, as they say, like getting out of the building. We in our fund try very hard to do this. We've taken our entrepreneurs to prison to work with inmates on plans for businesses they might start after they're released. We have gone to the country's first entrepreneurship vocational high school. I was in Tulsa 2 weeks ago. As much as I like spending nights at home with my kids, it's really about getting out of the building. And then My new one I want to try as soon as I can find a week is I want to spend a full week driving for Uber and Lyft, but I haven't figured out how to make that work yet. And then I just say that the people who are the scientists seeking the truth matter a lot. We do need, I mean, this is a plea for the health of our entire economy and society that we continue our efforts on getting a broader variety of voices. If founders continue to come from a sort of pretty narrow socioeconomic spectrum, they tend to be, here I am, a balding, middle-aged, straight white male venture capitalist telling you about this, but we so desperately need this wider variety. We try to use data for it, and one of the projects we do on that is we back very early startups. So in a way, my business is selling money to people. They're my customers. And if somebody pitched me my business and I said, how are you going to find your customers? They said, well, I'll go to conferences and I'll wait for people to introduce them to me. I'd say, well, that's a terrible business. I wouldn't invest in that. And so we decided we wanted to try to identify who would start companies earlier. And so we ran a small study. This is not big data. Using publicly available sources of information to try to predict out of the few million people we could identify in the technology industry who was statistically most likely to start to a venture-backed company. And we called it our Future Founders effort. And what we discovered from that is even when you train on the past set of venture-backed founders who are very narrow in their range of backgrounds, the predicted set, because you're just looking at their professional and educational experiences, is way more diverse. It's older. It's people of color. It's women. And so I think that if we're going to have a wider set of hypotheses, that's one of the blockers that we'll need to remove. And I'll just say I have lots of appetite to be part of this conversation with you. So you can find me here if you're curious about how we work. One of the things we believe about the future of work is that transparency is essential to it and in building trust. So if you go on our website, you'll see it redirects to a GitHub repository that is it was previously our private operating manual for our fund, but it's now been public for many years. And so my view is if you want to fix this great deceleration, startups are a great tool to do it. And startups that work on the future of work and workforce are one of these big, big problems where the problem is the asset, and we have lots that we can do. So thank you.